What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. And today my guest is Craig Newnes. Craig is an author, musician, historian, and critical psychologist. He is the author of more than 200 academic articles and 24 books, including Racism and Psychology, and he was a licensed clinical psychologist in UK. Craig is a singer and guitarist in 2 bands and has run several competitive marathons, among other accomplishments. So welcome to Madness Radio, Craig Newnes.
Thank you.
Wow, that's quite a list in your bio there, and we had to actually cut it short because you've got a few other accomplishments, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if being Jewish is an accomplishment, but surviving as a Yid is an accomplishment.
Yeah. Okay. So that we'll put that in there. And also, you mentioned that you're the father of 6 children.
I am indeed, and surviving that's an even bigger accomplishment.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned before that you haven't so far managed to kill any of them, and I suggested maybe the bar should be a little bit higher on your parenting.
Yeah.
So well, listen, let's that's a very interesting background you have, and so for people who don't know anything about you or haven't met you, anything, tell us a little bit about your background, how you got involved with this, and what's your relationship to critical psy, I think you said, because it's psychology, psychotherapy, and psychiatry all together. So tell us about your background with that.
You have to go back quite a long way. My dad was a ordinary working class bloke, and he worked in a factory, and I left home when I was 17 also to work in a factory. And at the age of 19, I thought there must be an easier life than this. So I applied to university, and I got a place at university to do an undergraduate degree in psychology, which I found both foolish and very easy. What I also did in my last year, my 3rd year, I attended a lecture of a guy who was talking about a career in clinical psychology. What was astonishing about the lecture from my point of view was he put up a load of pay scales on a board. And what it seemed to indicate was that your pay went up every year without needing to go on strike, because they were professional, they were professional pay scales, incremental scales. And I'd never known anything like that. And I thought, that's the job for me, I thought.
Right, because when you're working in a factory, it doesn't quite work that way.
No, you work 12 hours a day. Often you work 12-hour nights, and you're exhausted by the end of the week. And if you want more money, you have to go on strike.
And what kind of factories was it, just out of curiosity?
I worked in a rope factory where I was what's called an extruder operator. And I extruded nylon to make ropes. And those ropes ultimately went to huge ocean liners after they'd been wound round each other several times. I worked in Birdseye, I worked in Christian Salverson, and I eventually stopped because I was working as a ceiling tiler, and it was just so cold getting up at 4 a.m. to go and put these ceilings up in different places around the south of England. So I'd had enough by then. So anyway, this guy put these pay scales up, and I thought that's the job for me. And I did what's called a diploma in clinical psychology. Then I did my doctorate in clinical psychology. What got me into critical psychology was looking around me and thinking, this system is just terrible. This system can't work. I wasn't a sort of simplistic critical psychiatrist. I'd known a couple of very good psychiatrists. In fact, I'd trained in Boston. I worked in the States for a couple of years. And my supervisor there and my own analyst was a psychiatrist. And he was I thought he was good. I enjoyed him. But back in England, what I discovered was various psychiatrists were doing terrible things like electroshock. but also clinical psychology itself seemed to be so keen on getting paid as much as psychiatrists did that they didn't really care what they were asked to do. So psychologists were assessing people, they were offering all sorts of nonsensical therapies. And so I started writing about that. And I worked in a big department of psychological therapies in the National Health Service. I eventually had about 60 clinical staff working for me, of whom I would say probably 20 came because they were as critical as I was. And it was quite strange because they weren't critical of their salaries. They had no problem getting paid $70,000 a year, but they were very critical of the system they worked in. And many of them were extremely dedicated and simply good at changing people's lives. They didn't change people's lives by talking to them. They would talk to them a bit and then they would go and see what that person needed. And very frequently, of course, that person needed money. What a surprise.
What was it that you saw the system wasn't working and you became critical of it? Because it sounds like you stayed in the system and you continued to do it, but you wanted to do things differently, like, say, for example, focus on what people's needs are in terms of economics or poverty rather than other kinds of needs. So what does it mean to be a critical psychologist, I guess?
Let's assume someone comes up with a new therapy. There are something like 600 forms of therapy out there at the moment. And there are far more in America than there are anywhere else. But there are indeed 600 forms of therapy. Now, if we had an easy way of changing people, you'd only need a couple of forms of therapy. But actually there are 600. And I think there are 600 because it's a market. What the market does is it generates more and more therapies. And I looked around me and I saw a market for different kinds of therapy. I've done various therapies. That's why I'm so sane. I've done all sorts of things. There's also a huge market for drugs, and of course an enormous market for electroshock machines. Although that's reducing slightly now because they're using more sophisticated devices. The market is driven by self-interest. So in terms of being a critical psychologist, what I do is if someone produces a paper that says, here's the latest therapy, etc., 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 I deconstruct it in terms of self-interest. I look at it in terms of what are the benefits, not to the public, but what are the benefits to the writer in doing these things? Have you heard of boudoir photography? Boudoir photography, it was one of the therapies that Satz critiqued in The Myth of Psychotherapy. At the time, there were only 60 odd psychotherapies, but one of them for which you could get insurance payments was called boudoir photography.
This Thomas Saz critiqued this.
Yeah. And the idea was that if you were very depressed, if you were miserable, if you were feeling pretty bad, you went to a boudoir photographer who took a photograph of you in, quote, your best negligee, whatever that is, but a negligee. And then when you were feeling particularly miserable, when you were feeling awful, you would get the photograph out of your pocket and you would automatically feel better.
Okay, so this was a legit therapy,
completely legit, paid for by insurance companies
in the UK.
No, in America.
In America, okay. So
in the States, oh yeah.
And was there a so-called evidence base? There was a research that said, oh yes, this is effective and productive and produces change and scores on testing, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think that's my point about self-interest. It was indeed effective. It was extremely effective for the boudoir photographer who earned money out of it. And in the end, that's the essence of so many of these so-called new therapies. They are ways of creating a space in the market. And drug companies do it, and so do therapists.
But the claim would be, if someone is promoting boudoir photography as a psychotherapy, the claim would be, well, we did a randomized controlled trial. We took these people and we gave them boudoir photography, and we took this other group and we didn't. And the people that we gave our preferred kind of therapy to produce better results. And so is there substance to that, or is that also just part of the marketing?
There's not only there's no substance to the idea of RCTs for boudoir photography. But there's actually no substance to the idea of people researching therapy, because people don't research their own therapy. Let's assume you have a new patient comes to see you, and in my old department, in my practice, what we would do, we would say, name 3 things that you want from seeing me, and those things could be anything at all that the person wanted, and then we'd write them down, and that would become the contract.
Sounds similar to the way that I work with people.
Yeah. And when that was finished, we would see whether that person felt they'd achieved those things or not. And 6 months later, we'd look at it again. Now, we published the results of all of that. We were the only department out of hundreds of departments in the National Health Service to publish results on its own therapy using that kind of methodology. What happens is most people look at RCTs and then they claim to be doing, let's assume it's cognitive behavior therapy. People will look at the results of RCTs, randomized controlled. They will claim to be following whatever the protocol is. So it might be dialectical behavior therapy, it might be cognitive behavior therapy, could be anything. They'll claim to follow that. What they won't do is then assess in the way we used to assess whether the people they saw felt any better or not. If the people didn't feel better, they would frequently blame the therapy, because heaven forbid it was the therapist.
Right. I mean, this makes me think of the research that I've seen that also explains why there's maybe so many different kinds of therapy out there, but because the therapy doesn't really matter. It's really the therapist. It's the relationship between the therapist and the client. And it's really about how that relationship is established and how much feedback there is and how much confidence the therapist has that they can be helpful and focusing on the client's needs. Is that?
As we know, therapists are brilliant at relationships. Absolutely none of them have divorces or affairs.
Right.
Absolutely none of them beat their children. You see, I think the idea that a therapist can somehow bond with a complete stranger in such a way that that person changes, despite the fact the context of the person's life doesn't change, I think that's another illusion. I think that's arrogance. And the other thing, of course, is that most therapists will, when I was in analysis 3 times a week, and some of my friends were in 5 times a week. Most therapists, particularly in the National Health Service, only see their patients once a week for maybe an hour. The idea that having a relationship for an hour a week with a therapist can somehow change you is just hubristic on the part of the therapist. You could spend an hour with Jesus and nothing much would happen.
So you would have the people that you're working with identify the specific goals that they had. So if it wasn't the therapy that was doing it, and it wasn't the relationship that was doing it, was it just time? Was it just that the person had 6 months of time to get some progress towards their goals? I mean, what is your view of what is good therapy from a critical psychology perspective? Because I mean, some people would say you're right, forget it. The whole premise of psychotherapy is a fraud. We just need human relationships and friendships and community. But you are talking about providing some kind of therapy. So what is the reason that it's effective or helpful or positive?
I think I provided a safe space. And I provided a safe space in a number of ways. Because I was actually the boss of this place, I could organize things like the waiting rooms. And so we had internet connections in the waiting rooms that absolutely anyone could use. We had free refreshments for all the patients. And so just coming to the service for some people was much nicer than the kind of places where they lived. Some of those people would spend an hour with a therapist, and then they'd spend 6 hours in the waiting room where it was nice and warm in order to keep away from the violence at home. So one of the things I'd say I did was I provided a big safe space in terms of a place where patients could meet other patients over a coffee or whatever. but also in the room itself. Particularly, I worked a lot with women who'd been in very assaultative relationships. I think for some of them, well, I know for many of them, uh, it was they were terrified the moment they walked in, because he was a tall guy with a beard, and they were meant to somehow talk to me. And over a period of months, they would eventually, not all of them, but some would eventually talk to me. Some would just turn around and say, "No, this is unbearable. I can't be with you." So for the people who made it, as it were, it was a safe space. And some people took a very, very long time to make it. I saw a guy um, who'd had some horrible, horrible bereavement stuff going on. I saw one guy for 12 years, which in the NHS, National Health Service, is virtually unheard of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because it's not a fee-paying service. People come in, and 12 years is quite a long time in National Health Service. I think he formed an addiction, I think.
But usually the NHS won't approve that kind of, because it's managed, right? It's not just a voluntary, you come as much as you want.
Oh, no, yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
I was indeed, but because I was the overall director.
I see. So you could let it go longer.
Yeah, the way we got around that was to if you averaged it out, you see, so
Mm-hmm.
some people would come and see me or somebody else. They'd come just once. Some people would come for 20 minutes and think, "Oh, this is awful." Other people would come for several years. If you averaged it out, it probably worked out around about 3 months, and 3 months would have been acceptable. I saw hundreds of patients. So.
I really like this idea of thinking about what resources are missing in the community. If the person doesn't have a warm place to go, if they
Yep.
don't have a safe place to go, a comfortable place, free refreshments, a place to kind of hang out, use the internet, make friends,
Yep.
then you're actually, you're in a sense, you're kind of providing a community development step
Kind of.
for
Yep.
that community. So I really like that way of framing it. But isn't the creation of safety also about the relationship? I mean, aren't there some, did you find that some of the staff that you had, they just weren't able to really create that kind of safe relationship with the individuals because they didn't have that listening quality or that warmth, or they didn't have that kind of welcoming attitude towards people? I'm not even sure what to say the quality of safety would be, but
Well, I guess the thing is that safety for some people is not safety for others.
that's right. That's right.
So for you and I, we might prefer warmth. Somebody else might prefer firmness.
Yeah.
So there might well be a therapist in the department who I regarded as, too firm, too authoritarian, and yet that therapist would develop relationships with different kinds of people to the ones I would develop relationships
Yeah,
with.
I definitely hear that. I mean, that's one of the things that I try and do is not make assumptions about what the responsiveness is. Some people need a lot of space of just listening, and some
Yeah.
people need more like a, hey, what about this? You said this last time. Did you follow up on it? I want to hold you to this.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
think that's about the quality of the relationship and the ability to be responsive to the feedback and the sort of uniqueness of each person. Because it sounds like in your service, you weren't just assuming everybody needed the same thing. You
Oh
were
no.
able to match people with different therapists that maybe they would do better with, or they would like better, or they would connect with more, which makes a lot. I think that comes back to the whole marketing thing, or maybe the capitalist aspect of this, is that we're sort of mass producing a commodity of psychotherapy rather than meeting individuals as individuals and relating to them more personally, one-on-one, in a unique kind of way.
Well, it's sold as if it's a mass production process. It's sold a bit like Snickers. So
Yeah.
it's like every therapy session called something CBT is going to be the same as every other therapy session called
Right. The
CBT.
ingredients are regulated, and yeah, there's the same ingredients. Yeah. Which is absurd because the different therapist and different life and different context. Exactly.
That's the way it's sold, but it's not only a
Mm.
different therapist. The therapist is a different therapist every day.
Yeah.
but we all change all the time. So if one day you're feeling fairly calm and you're able to respond in ways that the person seeing you regards as sympathetic, and the following morning you can't get a parking space,
Right. Right.
you turn up pissed off, and the same patient suddenly finds you're much less understanding, and you have no control over that. Therapists like to create the illusion that they can somehow control the way they are, but no one controls the way. No, we can't control the way we are. You and I are currently reacting to each other in terms of smiles and nods and all sorts of other things,
Yeah.
but we have absolutely no idea what the other person's going to say next, so we can't predict
Right.
what's going to happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. So then what about the argument that say, well, Craig, why did you stick around? I mean, if there's so many problems with psychotherapy and you're a critical psychologist, why not just find a different profession? I mean, there are people who are more anti psychotherapy and anti psychology and anti psychiatry and don't even want anybody to be doing individual therapy, because it should be about resources and the community and mutual aid and friendships and rebuilding society and challenging economic oppression and this whole perspective. What is it that kept you doing it?
You already know.
Okay.
It was a hell of a lot easier than working in a factory,
All right. Right.
and I had 6
Right.
children to support.
Right. Well, that's a pretty cynical answer. Is that
That,
really the only reason that you did psychology, is because it was a easier job and you made some money?
do you know the original definition of cynicism?
It's cynicism is from Greek philosophy, right?
Yeah, the cynics.
Pre-Socratic, yeah, the cynics.
It's seeing life how it really is.
Okay.
That's what cynicism is.
But you didn't feel any calling. You didn't feel like you were actually really helping people and contributing to people's lives and doing something positive. And
I think I did contribute to people's lives, but remember, these people were well, they weren't strangers by the time I'd seen them for a few sessions,
sure, yeah.
but many of these people were complete strangers to me. And I had more than enough people around me to try and be kind to or provide for. I didn't need to go somewhere else to do that. It's just that the place where I went, I could earn some money doing it. In addition to that, of course, because of my role as a director, I did have the power to appoint certain kinds of people. And for example, I appointed a psychiatrist on the basis that, although she practiced cognitive analytic therapy, but the deal was I would only employ her if she didn't prescribe drugs.
Okay.
And so she didn't prescribe drugs. So I had a minimal amount of power in that regard. So I guess there was a sense of not wanting to do harm. I didn't want to create a toxic environment for people. And most of my research is a rather small attempt to make things a little better. But for every paper I write saying electroshock is bad or drugs are bad or whatever, there are hundreds and hundreds of papers saying electroshock is great. We need more drugs,
Right.
more
Right.
therapies. So I don't pretend that I've made much difference, but I know I've made a difference to my family. They're all fed and well and very healthy and happy people.
Tell us a little bit more about it. So critiquing do you feel like electroshock should be banned? Do you feel like drugs should not be used? I mean, I'm certainly sympathetic to both of those perspectives, but you said that they're bad. So should we just abolish them?
Electroshock is banned in Slovenia.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
It's the only country in the world where it's banned. It was previously banned in Germany and Holland, but it's back there now. In terms of drugs, I think you should be able to just buy them in a pharmacy.
What about so-called recreational drugs? Would you say that
All the same stuff, the same as coffee, the same as whatever.
Yeah. I would lean in that direction in terms of public policy. And they're not sold as treatments for diseases or
Exactly.
disorders. It's just, this is a substance that's going to get you high. Good
Yeah,
luck.
or not.
or not,
Yeah,
or right, or exactly,
and
exactly.
it takes the medical bit out of the equation.
Yeah, I would really agree with that, because that's part of the damage, is that people are mystified into thinking that these are somehow treatments and magical substances that are targeting symptoms or imbalances or targeting your psychosis or something.
I would also remove one element of the American Constitution.
Okay.
I would remove the right to seek happiness. Happiness is such a temporary,
Yeah.
happiness. You'll have been happy on occasion. You might have looked at a sunset. It's so temporary. But people seek happiness through buying a big car, or
Hmm.
buying a beautiful house, or having a so-called perfect marriage. And of course, happiness is very fleeting. So the right to seek happiness implies it's a good thing to do to seek happiness. I think you should just let life wash over you. And if you find the occasional happy moment, good luck to you.
It's significant that religions and spiritual perspectives, even existentialism, doesn't really see happiness as the highest. It's actually
No,
it's a very trivial thing about life. I
yeah.
think I would agree with that. Pursuing happiness is a pretty shallow thing to do if you think about it.
Try being Jewish. If I were Orthodox, I would have 613 mitzvot to follow.
Right. Right. There's not going to be happiness out of that.
In theory, there
In
is,
theory, right. Well, yeah. Yeah.
but that's an awful lot of rules.
Yeah, yeah. Salvation and redemption and transcendence may not be the same as happiness.
No,
There's a number of different Buddhist teachings that really warn against going for experiences of pleasure in
yeah,
meditation, even if it's relaxation. Or so
yeah.
is that something that you bring? Do you bring a spiritual or religious perspective to your life and work, or?
Well, in my book, in racism in psychology, I talk about. I not only talk about my Jewish roots, I talk about the Jewish roots of psychology, and how many theorists, like Freud,
Freud, for
obviously,
example? Yeah.
how many theorists were Jewish. Also, how many of the theories are essentially Jewish theories. So, id, ego, superego is a version of a rabbinical belief about the nature of the self. So, in that sense, I bring religion in. I've only seen a couple of people who saw me explicitly because I was Jewish, and they were also Jewish, and therefore they trusted me. I'm not quite sure why they trusted me, but they did. You see, I have trouble with words like spirituality. I don't know
Yeah.
what it means. One of my books is called Psychotherapy and Spirituality, and one of the chapters in it is by a wonderful guy called David Smale, and his chapter is called How to F the Ineffable. What he talks about is how spirituality is ineffable. You can't touch it. You can't actually say what it is. And what will happen is someone who's having a so-called spiritual experience will say, well, you can only know what this is like if you have this experience too. Well, I don't know if I wouldn't know if I've had that experience. I suspect not.
Yeah.
I haven't had that experience going to synagogue. I tell you, they're grim places.
Yeah, yeah. Formal institutional religion doesn't have a lot of
Yeah,
appeal for me, but I really relate to that, because I think that I'm drawn to kind of more inquiry around religion or spirituality that proceeds negatively. Like if we can clear the way, get language out of the way of what it is that we're, and then some kind of silence or something comes in that is really ineffable, and kind of maybe
yeah.
poetry and paradox might start to approach it.
I'm probably closer in terms of poetry.
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I do believe that certain kinds of poetry. Well, it depends. Again, it's a dialectic, isn't it? It depends on who's reading it and how they're interpreting it.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I do believe there are certain poems that are transcendent, and somehow that does something. I don't know what it does, but it does something to me.
Often by poets that don't see themselves as religious, or I can
No,
get
oh, absolutely.
I can have a very religious spiritual experience reading E. Cummings or Charles Bukowski, and I just like, yeah.
How strange! Yeah. I gave my son's girlfriend a copy of E. Cummings for her birthday
Nice.
because E. Cummings happens to be my favorite poet.
Oh, well, I'm looking at my copy of the complete poems is over on the shelf right there because oh, absolutely. Yeah, and of course
Wow.
now is spring, his favorite time of year, so
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and
Cool.
he was extremely anti politics and
Yeah.
anti organized religion, and he was kind of a bit of a snob. He was sort of against most humans because it seems like humans were missing the point. But I love his the immediacy of I don't know, just the mystery and wonder of life being the source of
Sure.
something transcendent and beauty and love, and yeah.
In one of my books, which is Clinical Psychology, a Critical Examination, which has what's best described as a bit of an assault on the clinical psychology profession.
Good for you.
That went down really well with some of my colleagues. But in there, I have a long section on literature, particularly novels, that tell us a lot more about being human than psychology ever can.
Absolutely. I think that was one of Freud and Jung's points that
Yeah,
you don't become a good therapist, let's say, by studying textbooks about neurobiology. By being a
no,
human, studying philosophy, studying
yeah,
literature, and that comes back to what you were saying about Freud drawing on the Jewish religious
yeah,
tradition in developing his views, because I think it was also just he was a very synthetic writer. He would borrow all these different things. I mean,
yeah,
Nietzsche is hugely influential. The Romantics were very influential on the origins
yeah.
of psychoanalysis.
Now, this is what I would interpret as self-interest. So you mentioned one way of becoming a better therapist is to read literature. What I'm talking about is being a better human
A better
being.
human being. Excellent.
I,
Yes,
I don't
exactly.
I don't care about being a therapist. And so the trouble is that so many of the people I used to see, uh, several of them had money. They could go to the library. They could find a safe space in order to read. And I would sometimes recommend, I don't know, Winnie the Pooh to them or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And I'd recommend various.
A deeply spiritual text, Winnie the Pooh.
Indeed, yeah, the Tao of Pooh. But I'd recommend various books to them. The difficulty with doing that, of course, is that uh, when someone reads a particular text, they interpret it in a particular way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I might have well interpreted, I don't know, there's a wonderful book came out in the 70s. It was called Puffball by Fay Weldon.
Hmm.
It was a feminist book. It was a book about a woman. Puffball was, I thought, a great book about relationships. But of course, I read that as a man, as a
Mm-hmm.
relatively young man, and recommending that to a 65-year-old black woman on a housing estate would have probably had a completely different outcome. In fact, she'd have probably
Mm-hmm.
said, "Why on earth are you giving me a book to
Right.
read?
Right.
I need a lawyer and a bodyguard."
Right. Right. It doesn't speak directly to my experience. Well, I'm always very cautious about recommending books or anything for that reason. But
Yeah,
I also want, sometimes I feel inspired or an intuition to offer something because it's meaningful to me, and
yeah,
maybe it resonates with how the conversation has been
yeah.
going. And one of the books that I find myself, this is maybe cliched, but I find myself recommending a lot is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And I'm just
Oh, do
curious,
you?
oh, you hate that book. I was thinking you might have a contrarian position on that, but I'm just curious.
I read that when I was probably about 19, and I've read it a couple of times since. And when I was first doing clinical psychology, I seriously thought about doing logotherapy because he came up with this thing called logotherapy.
Right.
However, about would it be 10 years ago now, Frankel was booed off stage by a group of people, and you can look this up on the web, who had discovered that although I think his wife died in Auschwitz, and I think his mother died in a different camp. Um, uh, Frankel himself was kept in a railway siding and then ended up going off to non-killing camps. So he wrote the book as if he was surviving Auschwitz.
Okay.
It's just a lie. He wasn't there at all.
You're bursting my bubble here, Craig.
Well,
I appreciate it, but it's uncomfortable.
I've got worse than that.
Oh no,
He
here it
also
comes.
he also volunteered to help doing brain experiments on Jewish inmates.
Oh my gosh. Okay, he's stricken from. I just canceled Viktor Frankl from my recommendation
Oh,
list. So.
I could give you a whole list of people to cancel.
Oh, okay. Well, we can go there for sure. But it's important that we not idealize or put up on a
Yeah,
platform. But let's think about, if the myth of Viktor Frankl is worth studying rather than the actual history of Viktor Frankl. There's this idea that even in the most worst circumstances, we may have some choice. Even in the most powerless or oppressive of circumstances, we may have some options. And I'm just curious, like, because I had mentioned about your spirituality, or maybe you have a more existential or humanistic frame, but what is sort of your approach to kind of the human condition or experience that maybe underlies a lot of, or maybe that's nonsense. Maybe it is really about just practical resources that people need for their own well-being and thriving.
the reason I retired is that in 2003, December the 23rd, 2003 to be exact, I had a major car accident.
Oh.
And I was in hospital in a suspended coma for 3 weeks. And
Wow.
it was taken for granted that I was going to die
Wow.
because I'd broken my neck, I had a twisted spinal cord, I'd broken 4 ribs, punctured lung, I had brain damage, you name it. I was in a mess. And my brother used to come and see me every day. And the consultant, apparently, while I was, unconscious, obviously, the consultant said to my brother, I, 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 I can't quite believe this. He's choosing to live. I wasn't choosing anything.
Hmm.
My body was living. My body was doing what it does. And you see, I know choice in the modern era is a big idea. We can choose to be this person. We can choose to be that person. But I'm not sure I really believe in choice. I think we just kind of do what we do, and we do it almost automatically. So, for example, you're not going to choose what you say after I've finished saying this.
Yeah, that correct. Yeah, I mean, it's right. Then there's research. There's, I guess, Libet's research looks at that often we
Yeah,
rationalize after the choices
yeah,
made. But it brings me back to something you said before about, we were talking about spirituality, and you said the
oh yeah,
ineffability of it. And I think William James, his approach, because he had a pragmatic approach, and that I find myself very connected to that. His approach to spirituality and religion was very simple. Does it make you a kinder person? How is
yeah.
it shown in its fruits? I think is the idea, is that, does it actually have a practical impact? Because the getting high and connecting with God and having this far out experience, what does it really mean if it's not actually contributing to the well-being of other people? And so I'm also thinking of James, when you were saying about free will. I think the conclusion that he came to was, I have free will because I choose to believe that I have free will. That he couldn't practically prove that it
No,
existed. In fact, the research suggests that, whoa, in fact, if you try and turn off your thinking or make changes in your life, and you see that there's this automatic momentum that we have, and the idea of free will is actually often after the action. But maybe as a kind of stance, an existential stance in the world, that believing as if we have some choice does make us freer and more kind to the people around us, and maybe more
maybe.
courageous in challenging oppression and standing up for what's right. I mean, I don't know.
But that would also work the other way, wouldn't it? It, it, if you can believe in free will, be a member of the Catholic Church and be Mussolini. And so
Absolutely, yeah. It's
so if
not necessarily going to produce compassion or kindness or
no,
care, right?
no. So the choice, if you believe that people have a choice, then the choice through free will can be in either direction, and they
It
can justify it in terms of religion, spirituality, whatever.
absolutely. There would be no moral guarantee that there would be the one path or the other. But in this context, it's about hope for change. If someone, because often people come in and they describe and they experience an overwhelming force of circumstance that has crushed them, and
Yeah,
their position is very strongly, I am powerless, I am being controlled, I am being devastated, I am. And then we sort of turn it into, oh well, it's the victim role, but it's actually much more complicated than that, because it is a real experience of
yeah,
super powerlessness. And people describe depression, I've experienced depression as a physical weight
yeah,
that's crushing you down. So the idea of choice and free will to me is tied to this sense, maybe it's faith, that there is hope, that the person can find a way forward. And maybe that's not free will that gives them, but there's some way out, that it's not just a hopeless, okay, you're a physical object that's been crushed by a rock, and then that's the end of the conversation because you're in Auschwitz, or you've been oppressed, or you're in an economic circumstance. That there's always some possibility for growth and change. And I guess Jung also had this sort of fundamental optimism towards people, that there's a kind of a force of nature that's moving through, giving opportunities, giving possibilities, giving potential. And for me, that's what Frankl's story, the myth of Frankl versus the reality, if I understand what you're saying correct, and I believe it, that there is always going to be that potential for humans to move forward.
do you want me to burst your Jungian myth?
Please do. I look, I'm familiar. If you're going to go the Nazi German direction, that I'm a little bit familiar with that. I have looked at that. Colonialism, racism. I'm aware that Jung had his shadow, but please do burst my Jungian myth. But I want to think about a little bit more about this free will and hope aspect. Like, how do you have hope for everybody that you work with, that they can get better?
No, I don't believe they're ill.
Okay. I didn't say they're ill. I just said better, on their own terms. Like, if someone
Well,
says, I can't afford to feed my children, do you have both hope and faith that that might change?
I don't have hope and faith, but I might have a system to help them do that.
But then what is your system based on, if it's not the possibility, at least a non-zero chance
Well,
that
it's
it could?
because the chances are I know more about the system than they do. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, if someone might not be claiming enough of their social security benefits,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and they'll say they can't afford this, they can't afford that, and when I practiced, I would help them fill in their claim forms so they would get money. So it wasn't just hope; it was a very practical piece of help
Practical
for them.
ways for, I mean, I have the same when I work with people around medications. I may understand something about coming off or changing medications, or I may have a practical way that they don't know yet
Yeah.
about improving their circumstance. But what about just suffering in general, the idea that
Well,
someone has some emotional.
well, you were talking about offering hope, and one of the things that David Smale used to say, and he said it very eloquently, is that the job of a therapist in the end is probably no more than offering clarification and hope. And so the aim is to clarify what the
Mm-hmm,
person's difficulties might be.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And in doing that, they might implant some hope. A critical perspective on that would be that the clarification might indeed be helpful, but the implication is that if your problems are clarified, you should be able to do something about it.
Oh, you may not. You may not.
But and many people can't, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the outcome of that session or two is the patient actually feels a failure. They feel worse. So they've had some hope and they haven't done what the clarification suggested. So they feel worse. And that's a shame. But it wouldn't stop me attempting to clarify people's difficulties.
Right, but it's no guarantee that it's gonna. I mean, I would go in that direction too, because I think that my job certainly isn't to make decisions for the person, but I might help them take a look at different options or clarifications, or here's
Yeah,
some of the forces that you sound like part of you wants to die, but another part of you doesn't want to die. Tell me about that part of you that does not. Why are you here? What is it that keeps you? So maybe bringing some understanding, because that to me, that's related to listening. If I'm listening deeply enough, then it does have a clarifying. But
yeah,
in the end, even in apparently, because I've seen some incredibly desperate, I've been in pretty bad situations, but I've certainly, and I'm sure you have too. In the end, I just fundamentally believe that even if it's on a purely emotional, symbolic level, that there's some way to move forward. There's some way to rise above any kind of hopeless circumstance. And maybe that's a religious position that I have. I never
yeah,
give up on
maybe.
people. I never give up on situations, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's a kind of faith, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so come back to Jung. I didn't want to dodge the bubble bursting on Jung.
Masson wrote a lot about Jung going along with Nazi ideas and so on. And
It's just certainly there's certainly truth in that for sure.
yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
to an extent, I've defended that, because if you wanted to carry on practicing in Nazi Germany, you were hardly going to say no, were you?
Yeah. Yeah.
But but the the more intriguing thing is that in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections,
Mm-hmm.
which is his autobiography.
A book that I adore, so I'm bracing myself for being burst here. So
Well, in that book, of course, he talks about um, various of his concepts, and like, I don't know, animus, and like having the female side and the authoritarian, all of that. What's intriguing about it is that he deals with the Second World War in less than 2 pages. And at no point in those 2 pages does he suggest that Hitler is anything other than a projection of the worst kind of authority figure. I think it's a masterful book. And I think the beginning of the book is absolutely brilliant. But he seems to abandon common sense during this section on the Second World War. Because, like I say, it's only 2 pages.
mm-hmm.
And, he was writing in a context that I think he published it in, what was it, 60 something? So the Second World War wasn't that far away. The Holocaust
Mm-hmm.
wasn't that far
Mm-hmm.
away.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow or other, in this entire book, he managed not to mention the Holocaust. And that, I just find that extraordinary.
I hear what you're saying. I do. But my bubble isn't burst. However, I'm ready for some
Okay.
pushback, because I would say that actually it's very easy, maybe easier psychologically, to blame a Hitler, or to, I mean, absolutely we have to hold the criminals accountable, but the more radical or the more responsible question is, why do so many people go along with authoritarian leadership? Because that's how we're going to prevent, because it's easy to say Hitler, Germany, World War II, and not look at Allen Dulles and George Bush and the history of the United States and colonialism and the Congo and the British Empire, and all the ways that we are ourselves wrapped up in this monstrous Holocaust that isn't just over there and done with, and then we can package it up and blame the bad people of history. So I'm not convinced that your critique is necessarily against Jung. It might actually be in favor. I think it
But
strengthens him, because he's asking all of us to look at the banality of evil within our own participation with these movements and these structures.
but in that book, Jung has no problem accusing other individuals. He has no problem praising other individuals. So it's not like he contextualizes everything. He doesn't talk about Freud as being the ultimate father figure. It's so I think what you're betraying is your love of Jung, which
Well,
is fine.
yeah, I have. It's interesting. I've been thinking about this quite a lot, because it's not really Jung the man, because I wouldn't defend, and that you're bringing this in. I certainly, I think that Jung has the racist, sexist, homophobic. I mean, the implications of his participation in homophobia in psychology is horrific.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there were choices that he made during the Nazi era, and maybe what you're saying is absolutely, he certainly downplays colonialism. He certainly doesn't. There's
Oh yeah.
lots of racism, but I think my love is not for the man, but it's for the something that he's after, which is
Mm.
this idea that we're all part. It's this mystical insight that we're all part of this shared collective soul, and we're all growing together. And the way that we participate in nature, we maybe have to bring back some of the traditional indigenous archaic involvement of dreams and imagination and the
Mm-hmm.
participation mystique and being part of nature, because then we can discover in ourselves and our own dreams and our symptoms and our illnesses how we're being challenged to grow and learn and change and transform who we are. And to me, that's a very, it's hard for me to talk about it because it is kind of an ineffable insight, but I can both critique Jung as the very flawed, white patriarch from Switzerland, as well as appreciate a kindred spirit in connecting with this almost mystical
Mm-hmm.
truth. At least that's how I. But
Okay.
but you've opened my eyes to some new critiques of Jung, which is appreciated. So should we, since we've started on the topic of racism and psychology, do you want to talk about that work that you've done? And I'm also interested in your thoughts about the continuities between psychiatry and maybe some of the eugenics of the Nazism and US, and how all that is connected in, because I imagine that your critique of racism and psychology is not just limited to we need more access for people of color to psychological and psychiatric treatments, which is kind of how it's framed in the mainstream discussion.
I think we need less.
I would agree. Yeah,
Given that my perspective on psi is that it's generally harmful,
exactly.
the idea that we should adjust it um, to enable more people to flood in and be so-called treated. And of course, the difficulty is that if people from what would be called black and minority ethnic communities or indigenous people, if people from those communities came into Psi more as patients, their problem would be that they're still confronted with very white westernized
That's right.
therapies.
That's right.
So the therapies themselves would have to massively change. And I don't think that there's much of a will from people who currently run clinical psychology courses or counseling courses or psychotherapy courses. I don't think there's much of a will for them to change.
I would agree with that. That's the disproportionate argument that we need to
Yeah.
bring greater access and equality. But what about the roots of psychology and eugenics and the whole improvement science and evolutionary superiority? And
Oh, it's a long story. The putting it at its simplest, the early psychologists who formed, for example, the British Psychological Society in 1904, people like Spearman and Pearson, they were eugenicists. They believed that certain kind of breeding would lead to a degeneration in the species. In Germany, in about 1902 maybe, you had the Jena Prize, and the Jena Prize was a prize that was eventually won by someone called Schallmeyer, which was about proving how certain genetic predispositions would lead to madness, what we'd now called intellectual disability, etc. In the States, of course, you had compulsory sterilization in various states until 1911 for people who had done poorly on IQ tests. The reason they'd done poorly is that no one had taught them to read or write.
exactly.
Many of those people were indeed black. You had people like Brigham, who was tasked with selecting out what he described as Negroes to serve in separatist units after the First World War. So all of these people were psychologists. Terman of the Terman-Merrill Index, they were all basically eugenicists, and they were indeed psychologists. And that's the kind of fundamental root of psychology. Now, you can't sort of look back and say these people were wrong, because that was the context. There were very committed socialists, people like Virginia Woolf, and despite the fact they were committed socialists, people like Bernard Shaw, they were also eugenicists. Eugenics was almost a fashion.
It was very widespread. It was kind of the leading edge of science and just part of what everyone was into.
Absolutely, and that forms the fundamental basis for psychology. Now, that's why I am much more suspicious of psychology than I am of, for example, astrophysics.
Of course.
Astrophysics, to my knowledge, doesn't claim that Saturn's moons are better than the moons on Uranus because they're a particular color. At least I don't think. For me, that's kind of a fundamental flaw in psychology. The other huge flaw in psychology,
the fundamental flaw being that it really reflects the fashion of its times. It's fundamentally culturally bound.
Absolutely, but lots of its theories are based on eugenic theories, and those theories haven't gone away. So for example,
well, that was my next question, because someone would say, "Oh, this is the past, Craig, but how does it continue in the present?" That's the main. That's the main question.
Those theories haven't gone away. So a very simple example of this isn't about race, but a simple example is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And when I trained to use the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, I was trained to use it in such a way that you had raw scores, and then you converted those into scores based on norms. And so what would happen is you'd have female raw scores and male raw scores. The reason you had to do the conversion was that David Wechsler in 1938 discovered that women always scored better than men. So what he did was to split the scores in half. So women were rated against each other. And it's that kind of thing that continues to haunt psychology. It still goes on to this day. Well, a simple example of racism would be selection procedures. So in this country, there are something like 10,000 clinical psychology trainees, as they're called, interns, maybe 6,000, of whom, wait for this, 90% are white women in their late 20s. Now that's
so much for the post-colonial society.
And the States isn't much better. In the States, only 10% of clinical psychologists with doctorates are from what we would call ethnic minority backgrounds. But
then does the solution just become to have more equitable, more proportionate representation? Because then that can become tokenism if the ideology and the practice hasn't fundamentally changed, right?
See, I don't think there is a solution to it, because I don't think there's a will to change it. The division of clinical psychology in this country has been claiming to try for something like 30 years to change the balance of entrance into the profession. And in 30 years, they haven't managed it. What they have managed to do is every couple of years, they say, we must do something about this.
Right.
So I think that kind of, I think the racism is inherent in many of the theories. I think the racism is inherent in the number of people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds or indigenous backgrounds that come into the profession, and the racism's also there in the practice. I think the racism actually works both ways. If it's quite possible that, in fact, I've got a friend he's a psychotherapist. He's a Black psychotherapist, and he has had white clients walk in and then walk straight out again on the basis they don't want to see a Black therapist.
Yeah.
So it does in fact work both ways. But I think what you're kind of left with is people absorb all sorts of myths about certain others. So one of the myths about my tribe is that we're all incredibly well off and we control the world's banks.
Right, right.
Now, I only control one of the world's banks, and it's quite a big one. But that's a kind of a myth that's there. Now, it's very difficult not to respond to those myths. So if you grow up with certain myths around indigenous people, around black people as well, if you grow up with those myths and one of your patients turns out to come from that community, I think it's very difficult not to see your patient according to those myths. It's no different from if you're ageist and a relatively old person comes in. I'm relatively old now, but I can remember when I was training, people would come in their 40s, and I think, my God, they're in their 40s. Look at them. And it's very hard to escape that kind of automatic judgment.
Yeah. So in this discussion, I mean, let's put it in a bigger context. I mean, are you a socialist or an anti-capitalist? I mean, I certainly have that orientation that it seems like a privatized medical system and a hyper individualistic exploitation driving inequality. There's no way that we can actually talk about mental health without talking about larger social and political and economic changes.
No.
I mean, is that where you would where your thinking would go as well?
Well, I'm not sure I'd talk about mental health, but
Right, abolish mental health, I think, is maybe the way we need to go.
well, I'd abolish the idea of health, because health is another capitalist notion. Everything is sold in terms of health. You never see a drink product saying, buy this drink, it'll make you ill. It's all
Right,
about
it's another
health.
marketing thing. Yeah, the capitalism. So is that the solution? Should critical psychologists sort of think in anti-capitalist and getting beyond capitalist and forming common cause with?
I don't think we have either an end of capitalism in sight or a solution to capitalism. And of course, I benefit from capitalism. You know, capitalism has enabled me to buy this microphone for
Of
10
course,
bucks.
that's one of the diabolical things is we're all
Yeah,
plugged into. It's like an abusive parent. We're getting fed and clothed
yeah,
and sheltered.
yeah.
But that's where my faith comes in. Maybe. I mean, I'm with you. I mean, it's looking very grim. We're in bad, and we haven't even started to talk about the ecological crisis. But do psychologists, do people have a responsibility to not just adapt their patients, but to start to think critically about the social, political, economic context, and maybe have a little bit of faith and hope that, if we might be able to make some changes. Otherwise, it's just a very depressing end game.
In England, there's a group called the Community Psychology Group, and they aspire to enabling communities to live better lives by doing simple things like helping to have them change their where the children are able to play. So suddenly they can have bigger green spaces, simple like things like that. You also have the Psychotherapy Society for Social Responsibility, and these are psychotherapists who look outwards rather than inwards and look at the circumstances of people's lives and so on. And I don't think those psychotherapists are particularly embarrassed that they earn good money doing it, because I think they are doing their best for other people at the same time. So in terms of critical psychology, I think critical psychology would welcome the kind of things these groups are doing, but at the same time, it would find a way of critiquing what they're doing. Not necessarily to stop them doing it, but just to say, well, yes, but there's also this factor involved.
Craig, we don't have a lot of time left in the interview. Is there anything you'd like to ask me in this interview, or ask our listeners for me to think about?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you the same thing that I ask my children after not anymore because they're grown up. But when we went somewhere special, I would always ask them two questions. And so the first question is, and this is, if as a therapist, I used to do this as well at the end of an hour. This is worth doing. So I would say to you, Will, what's been the worst bit of our discussion for you? Doesn't have to be terrible, just has to be the worst bit.
So I have to answer now.
Yeah.
Well, the being put on the spot is, I'm not usually asked questions by the guests, so being put on the spot. The worst bit, I think it'd be hard for me to say the worst bit. I think there's been uncomfortable moments when I've been challenged, but I found that actually really satisfying because I like the depth and the thinking. The worst bit, I think, to be honest, the worst bit is knowing that you don't have more time and that you were maybe getting uncomfortable where you're sitting, and that was probably I would say the worst bit.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Well, okay, what's been the best bit?
Oh, the best bit is having to think a little bit more deeply about Jung, and then also just the way in which you're critical, because usually I'm the most critical guy in the room when it comes to Psy, and to being out criticaled was great. Was great.
Good. Okay. Would you like me to plug a book or two?
Yeah, please do, Craig. We need to wrap up and let people know how they can contact you. Tell them about your books and if they want to find out more about your work.
Okay, they can join the Herd Community, HEARD Community Facebook group. That's my band.
Great. Okay, great.
And they can watch a live stream. If they want to see more critical stuff in general, they should go on the Egalitarian Publishing website, and they can subscribe or get free copies of the Journal of Critical Psychology, Counseling and Psychotherapy. If they want to help my children eat more, they can buy copies of Racism in Psychology from Routledge. And if they want to change their lives, I have two books. One is called 52 Ways to Change Your Life. And the other one, which came out within 3 weeks of the first lockdown, is called 52 Ways to Survive a Pandemic.
Fantastic. Well, Craig Newnes, thank you so much for joining us today on Madness Radio. It's been wonderful.
Thanks for asking me.
Today, my guest is Craig Newnes. Craig is an author, musician, historian, and critical psychologist. He is the author of more than 200 academic articles and 24 books, including Racism in Psychology, and he was a licensed clinical psychologist in UK. Craig is a singer and guitarist in 2 bands and has run several competitive marathons, among other accomplishments. What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health.